Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our lecture series here at Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site. My name is Michael Lord. I'm the site manager here. Today, I get to play host, which is always a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank you for coming here in-house, and I want to thank the folks that are watching virtually as well. Welcome to our virtual Phillips Manor Hall. We are now entering into our fourth year of the History Lecture Series. And today's History Lecture Series, the presentation is going to be The Neutral Ground, Westchester County in the American Revolution. Our guest lecturer is Mr. Stephen Paul DeVillo. Mr. DeVillo is the author of The Bronx River in History and Folklore, The Battle of White Plains in Washington and Howe in Westchester, and The Bowery, The Strange History of New York's Oldest Street. Mr. DeVillo is a longtime tour guide for the Bronx River Rambles. He has given numerous talks and webinars on the topic of the Revolutionary War in local history, and his particular interest is in the Revolutionary War and the events within the New York area. Westchester County in the American Revolution is also available for sale in our gift shop downstairs. Mr. DeVillo will be available for even book signings, if so interested here. For those joining online, you may ask and post questions in the chat box. We will have time at the end of this presentation for a little bit of Q&A, which is always a welcome thing. We always enjoy it. So allow me to present Mr. Stephen Paul DeVillo.
Hello. Well, good evening. I'm really pleased to see everybody here, and I'm very grateful to Phillips Manor Hall for this opportunity to speak here, because we're sitting in a very, very historic spot here, and we're surrounded by history here in downtown Yonkers. As you probably know, this was the home of the arch-loyalist Frederick Phillips III. It was also a building where a very young George Washington was once a house guest. This was before he became, George Washington. But history is all around us. Frederick Phillips suffered greatly in the war for his loyalism. If you go down by St. John's Church, there's a bank building. If you go in, there's a big mural depicting Frederick Phillips III getting busted by the Patriots. And if you pick up the shore path Espionage south of the train station, go down a bit, you'll come across the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden. And this is a set of sculptures by this incredibly talented sculptor, Vinnie Bagwell. And I got to meet her some years ago. She's quite an interesting person. Who's most recently, she's done sculpture of Sojourner Truth, if you go up, all the way up to Walkway over the Hudson. But anyway, so the history is all around us, reminders of it and relics. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the events that bedeviled Westchester County during the Revolutionary War. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down for So, this is the revolution as we would like to remember it. And it probably is how it was depicted in your school books years ago. Everybody, crisply attired and observing, punctilious military etiquette. But that's only half the story. A great deal of the revolution was what has been termed by a number of historians America's first Civil War between the Loyalists and the Patriots. And this played out very violently in a large number of places throughout the 13 colonies. The backcountry of South Carolina, the Pinelands of New Jersey, the Hackensack River Valley just across the Hudson from us, and the Mohawk River Valley where this particular incident is taking place. But Westchester sat in the middle of all this, and a lot of this washed up here in Westchester County. Now, explain the term. Was termed at the time the neutral ground, and you might read this in a book and get the impression of some kind of a Switzerland, where everybody sat peacefully just eating cheese and chocolate all day. But
I'm just going to adjust the microphone a little bit.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it seems a little rattly. Okay, how's that?
That should be better.
Okay. The more appropriate, in 20th century terms, we would call this a no man's land. But of course, that expression would have to wait for another war 150 years later to become current. The term at the time was the neutral ground. And how this came about is in the 18th century, armies were not continuously in contact with one another as you have today, like in World War I. They're like, just 300 yards away was the enemy trenches. Generally, if you weren't fighting a battle or a campaign, you pulled back a respectful distance. Usually like 20-odd miles was an ideal distance, just about a day's march, so you wouldn't be surprised by anything the enemy would do, but you're close enough to the enemy you could send out your own spies and scouts to keep an eye on what they're up to and what they may be planning. So the neutral ground for most of the war, the Americans held a line along the Croton River. That's the thick blue line up in the north there. And from time to time, they would push south. They would occupy a line roughly Tarrytown to White Plains. The British, for their part, seldom stirred beyond the bridgeheads off Manhattan Island. There were two bridges leading off the island, and they kept the land on the opposite side, along with the Loyalist enclave in what today we would call the South Bronx, which I'll get to a little bit later. And speaking of the Bronx, there's a little bit of a geography lesson here. Westchester County at the time, as it was defined, included all of the present-day Bronx, ran all the way down to the Harlem River and the East River. And the Bronx was only split off, in a couple of phases, 1872, 1895, and finally became its own county in 1914. So when I say Westchester, I'm talking about the present-day Bronx. Where I live, I'm a lifelong Bronxite, and I'm very proud of that. So, and a lot of this played out in the precincts of the present-day Bronx. Now, the American Revolution was not a sudden thing. It broke out quickly. It was actually the Declaration of Independence was the end product of over 10 years of agitation and controversy, beginning with the Stamp Act in 1765, and with a few ups and downs, was gradually building force as you went on. These are a couple of pictures. This was a street theater on the left being done in Colonial Williamsburg, and they would end up burning this effigy too. They were really doing it realistic. And on the right, this was a wonderful picture of a participatory reenactment of a town meeting up in Maine. And so the girl in the hat's really getting into it. I said, I don't want to cross her. Anyway, part of the buildup was what was called the Pamphlet War. A lot of people were writing pamphlets all over the place. It was the 18th century equivalent of a podcast, if you will. And here in Westchester, the leading Loyalist thinker was a fellow by the name of Samuel Seabury, who held a pulpit at present-day St. Peter's Church in Westchester Square, and also at St. Paul's up in Mount Vernon. And he would issue a number of pamphlets, taking issue with what the Continental Congress was doing and arguing that, the only sensible thing to do is stay loyal to the crown. Let's not rock the boat too much. And he would sign it a Westchester farmer. Now back then, this was not frowned upon. When you wrote pamphlets, you always used a pseudonym, maybe something Roman, like Publius or whatever, but he signed himself a Westchester farmer, though the farmer party was far from it. But you can tell from this portrait, Samuel Seabury was a fellow who's very accustomed to being taken seriously and his words being clung to. You can imagine just how annoyed he must have been when he learned that all these brilliant pamphlets of his were being refuted by some smart aleck college kid down in Manhattan. And the funny thing is, the smart aleck kid was literally was a smart aleck. He was a very young Alexander Hamilton. He was then in his second year of college down at what was then King's College, today's Columbia University. And he started writing and publishing his own pamphlets, The Farmer Refuted. He was taking everything Samuel Seabury had to say to task and just turning it upside down. And this was kind of a watershed moment in the revolution because, Alex, he was like, 18, 19, he was very young, and time of life, you're not too sure what direction you're going to take. He was less than halfway through college at the time. But this was a revelation to young Hamilton, that A, he was very good at political argument, and he was very good at writing. So poor Samuel Seabury, trying to defend the crown, he inadvertently launched the career of one of the founders. So by the time the Declaration of Independence came to Westchester County, it was read out from the steps of the courthouse in White Plains. The county was already very much divided. People have been reading pamphlets, they've been discussing things, and the split was pretty well settled in, and there were a lot of loyalists here in Westchester County. In fact, while this guy is reading the Declaration from the steps of the courthouse, about maybe 50 yards away was a tavern, the Hatfield Tavern. The guy in the green jacket is looking right at it. And that was a noted loyalist hangout, where the spring before, loyalists had gathered, about 250 loyalists had gathered to sign a Declaration of Dependence, saying how they were loyal to the Constitution and the King and the monarchy and all that sort of thing. And yet, catty-corner across the road from the Hatfield Tavern was the Odell Tavern. That was a noted patriot hangout. And both these places would get burned down in the course of 1776, but that's another story. And there's a lot of political violence, particularly where the Patriots got the upper hand in terms of numbers and energy. And if you were a loyalist, it was not good to run afoul of these people. There were tars and featherings, sometimes murders, a lot of very physical violence taking place. So in a lot of areas of Westchester County, if you decide to remain a loyalist, it was just becoming too hot for you to stay in your home. And a lot of people started fleeing south to a safe haven. Now, a third force in Westchester County were the Quakers. And, we think of the Quakers, we think of, William Penn, Philadelphia, and, the guy on the Quaker Oats carton. But it isn't very well realized sometimes that New York and New Jersey were just as much a Quaker haven as Pennsylvania was. And here in Westchester County, you had about 3 or 4 congregations, meetings was the term the Quakers used. In some cases, dated back to the 1680s. And they're still there today, too. The Quakers are still very much a part of Westchester County's culture. But being Quakers, they were neutral. Part of the ideology was to abjure any kind of, military action or physical violence. So you can guess what happened. They're trying to remain neutral. They wound up catching hell from both sides. Attitude was setting in, whoever's not for us has to be against us. Now, a number of leading figures would dominate the story here in Westchester County as the violence began to mount. And one of the key figures was James Delancey. He was from a very wealthy Huguenot family, owned a set of mills along the Bronx River, about what today we would call Morrisania in the South Bronx. And people fleeing south would come to him for shelter, and he eventually set up an encampment in the South Bronx, roughly about, if you're familiar with the area, about where St. Mary's Park is, about 149th Street today. And he owned a number of mills, and he had a very nice mansion, which was named Union Hill, leaving no guesses as to which side this family was on. And the location was just immediately to the right of this dam. You might recognize this if you're going in south entrance of the Bronx Zoo. There's no trace of the mansion today. It's now part of the Wild Asia exhibit, and that's the monorail in the background that takes you to see the elephants and whatnot. But the estate was pretty much the footprint of the present-day Bronx Zoo. And it was quite a place. People would come up from the city, for a Masterpiece Theater kind of weekend, and they'd take a great carriage ride around the Bronx River. And one of the showpieces was the rocking stone, which is still there to this day in the Bronx Zoo. It doesn't rock anymore, but it did back then. And he'd stop the carriage, and Delancey was a pretty powerful guy. He was able to get out. Now, this boulder weighs about 90 tons, but it's pivoted so that one person can rock it back and forth. So he'd show off and rock the rocking stone, and all the women, ooh, they'd gasp, and everybody have a good time. Well, having set up a loyalist enclave, he quickly began to organize the able-bodied men into sort of a militia with which they could strike back at the Patriots in Westchester County. And for a number of reasons, Delancey's corps was never incorporated into the British Army establishment. You can always speculate on the reason why. So it never had an official name. It went by a number of names throughout the years. Delancey's Refugees, or the Westchester Refugees, or the Associated Loyalists, or better still, the Westchester Chasseurs. They should have kept that one. Oh, that was a really good name. But they were commonly known to anybody who was on the other side as the Cowboys. And this was where the word entered the English language, and did not mean Hopalong Cassidy or John Wayne and guys in the white hats. It was a pejorative term because Delancey's men, they managed their cash flow by rustling cattle from Patriot farms or Quaker farms, or sometimes a Loyalist farm too if they were desperate. So they became notorious for this, and they were termed the Cowboys. And the term would be a pejorative term like right up until the 20th century. Back in the Wild West, if you called somebody a cowboy and he knew it, well, this could result in a gunfight. did not mean anybody who's a good fellow. Now, the counterpart to the Cowboys, ostensibly on the Patriot side, were the Skinners. Now, on both sides, you had a lot of ad hoc groups of bandits claiming loyalty to one side or the other, but sometimes the loyalty could shift depending on who they wanted to rob. Yeah, they might come up to a farmhouse and open in the name of King George, you accursed rebel. Oh, but I'm a loyalist. Oh, did I say King George? I'm sorry. No, I meant the other George. George, what's his name? Washington, that's it. Open in the name of George Washington, you accursed Tory. It really mattered very little which side you're on if they wanted to rob you. Now, where the term Skinners came from, there's a bit of controversy about this. It's not entirely sure where this name originated. I mean, Cowboys is very straightforward, but Skinners, there's all kinds of theories. My theory is that the pro-American Skinners didn't just rob places, they made a habit of trashing the places that they robbed. I think there's a bit of class conflict going on here. I mean, they'd take the valuables, they'd take the cattle, then they go on to smash up the furniture, and just as a parting shot, and this was their specialty, they'd go rip the wallpaper off the walls, they'd skin the walls. That's my theory, whatever. But on the Loyalist side, they had a lot of regular units of either militia or Loyalist auxiliaries. And a very major figure, apart from James Delancey, was John Graves Simcoe, commander of the Queen's Rangers. Now, if you recall, if you watched the series Turn, back on AMC a few seasons ago, he was a major character in the series, but he was depicted as sort of a very entertaining psychopath. He's a really good character for television, but totally unlike the real John Graves Simcoe. Simcoe was a completely dedicated soldier, and he was also noted for just a complete lack of humor. He wasn't a mean guy, but it's just like, whatever synapse you need to process a joke, he just didn't have it in his head. But he organized the Queen's Rangers into one of the most effective and lethal Loyalist units in the war. And another major figure who stomped through Westchester was Bannister Tarleton. And he would pick up a number of very pejorative nicknames as the war went on, Bloody Ben or the Green Dragoon, or probably a few that I couldn't recite in public. But here in Westchester, he's most remembered for the burning of Pound Ridge and Bedford. Which, the burning of Bedford, by the way, is commemorated every year with, well, they don't really set the houses on fire, but they kind of, reenact the incident. And he would go on, to acquire a much more vicious and bloody reputation as the war moved to the south. But for about a year and a half, you heard Tarleton was on the loose, you took cover. Another noted figure was Andreas Emmerich. He organized a unit of Hessians and American deserters into Emmerich's chasseurs. Chasseurs is a very popular term at the time. Chasseurs was French for, hunters, chasers, that sort of thing. But it looked very classy if that was in your unit's name. Unfortunately, Emmerich's chasseurs didn't last very long. He was not a very good CEO, as it turned out, and there was a lot of infighting. Eventually, they'd be broken up. But they were a terror for about the year or so that they were operating here in Westchester. Andreas would come to a very interesting end, by the way. He'd go back home to Westphalia. And 1806, he would be shot by a firing squad after organizing a plot to kidnap Napoleon's brother. This is a very daring kind of guy, but that's a whole story for another day. And I find this probably the most tragic of the Loyalist figures in Westchester was Beverly Robinson. He was a childhood friend of George Washington. And he married into the Phillips clan, got himself a very nice estate, just above what today is Garrison, New York, opposite West Point on the Hudson River. And, poor Beverly, of course, would lose everything in the war. He'd be eventually compensated, like rate about 30 cents on the dollar for everything he lost. But during the war, he organized the Loyal American Regiment, which was a very well-regarded unit. And they too have their own reenacting unit. The guys here was green jackets with red facings. Very handy for the Christmas party. And I should point out, sometimes we think of, Americans were all blue and the British were all the redcoats. But the redcoats, the red livery was very strictly reserved for the King's regular army. And the redcoats themselves are very jealous of this. So if you were a loyalist unit or a militia unit, anything but the regular long-term service regulars, you couldn't wear red. You had to wear green or some other color, but it was usually green. That's why all these guys are clad in green. And it got a little confusing because on the American side, the dragoons were also clad in green livery. And this has led to a couple of tragic incidents as the war would go on. But on the American side, probably the most energetic and lethal commander was Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. And that portrait looks a little vaguely familiar. I'll tell you, yes, he was the father of Robert Edward Lee in the Civil War. You can see the resemblance around the eyes. Just add a gray beard and a gray uniform and you wouldn't know the difference. But he organized a very, very lethal unit that would come through Westchester County on a number of occasions, one of which I'll get to a little bit later. And a favorite figure of mine, because I'm of Breton descent, was Charles Treffin Armand, the Marquis de la Royère, which he came to America after a very swashbuckling career. He was a colonel in a very high-ranking French army unit. And, being an aristocrat, you got into duels. And he got into a duel, and he wounded his opponent. Turned out to be a cousin of King Louis XVI. Uh-oh, not a good career move. So he got on a ship just like one step ahead of the Bastille and came to America. But he did not try to get the Americans to pronounce all his surnames. He just let himself be known as Colonel Armand. And he would be a very effective dragoon commander. He made multiple attempts to capture James Delancey, quite without success, but He was one guy that made Delancey nervous. When Armand was on the loose, Delancey would find a way of disappearing real quick. Funny thing with Colonel Armand, he went back to France and he wound up dying a royalist. Now, he was a Breton patriot, but he opposed a lot of the enactments of the French Revolution. And story has it he died in 1793, supposedly from a heart attack that was brought on by the news of the execution of King Louis XVI. It's funny how people turn out sometimes. And this is a great guy, another Armand Louis de Goutant, the Duc de Lauzun, who was led, which I would argue was the best dressed unit ever to prowl Westchester County. Came over with Rochambeau's army in 1780, and his unit are what were known as hussars. And you've seen them in a lot of movies, the guys with the embroidered gold frogging and the little cape over the left shoulder and saber at the ready and a nice tall hat. And quite impressive, but he made James Delancey nervous too. At one point they came down through Westchester County, and learning that the Duc de Lauzun was on his case, Delancey literally evacuated his whole Loyalist enclave, moved everybody to Harlem Heights till the things cooled down. Now on the American side, you had a number of people known as the Westchester Guides. There are 8 of them in all, and with a couple of exceptions, I don't have any good pictures of these people. But their names are on a monument in Tarrytown, among whom were the brothers Abraham Odell and Isaac Odell. And you've seen the name Odell all over Westchester County in street names and historic sites. Isaac was an interesting person. He went by the nickname of Uck, U-C-K, because believe it or not, at this point in time, there are no less than 4 Isaacs in the Odell family. Why people did this, I don't know, but it makes genealogists out of their minds sometimes. But Uck Odell was one of the best of the Westchester Guides. And they were essential to the American cause because at the time he did not have good maps of Westchester County. Nothing like, the topographical maps a present-day Army officer would be issued. The best you get are like point-to-point maps. You could show you, okay, there's a road from Tarrytown to White Plains, but didn't give you any idea of the terrain, of the water courses, of the back roads, the farm lanes, and all this was very, very essential when you're running a guerrilla-type war. So the Westchester Guides would be called upon over and over again to guide the Americans. And one of the prominent figures among the Westchester Guides was John Dean. Now, I don't think it's any relation to the Watergate John Dean, but he was a very dedicated partisan in the American cause. When he wasn't on duty serving, at somebody's orders or request, he'd wage his own private war. And he would hunker down. This is not a good picture. It was the best I could do for the moment. There's a great big boulder known as John Dean's Rock. It's over by the South County Trailway in present-day Rockefeller State Park, by the Sawmill River Parkway. So if you're driving down the parkway, well, just keep your eyes on the road, but kind of give a glance to John Dean's Rock. And he would lay there in ambush waiting for a loyalist to show up. And he killed a number of loyalists that way. His rifle, by the way, is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So you go down there sometime, take a look at it. Another famous guy, I was just talking about him a few minutes ago, Andrew Corsa. Now, he was the youngest of the Westchester Guides, and consequently he was the only one that lived long enough to be photographed. Well, he had the best duty of all. He lived on his family farm, approximately a footprint of present-day Fordham University campus down in the Bronx. And one fine day, what shows up in the dooryard was the entire high command of the American cause. There's Washington, there's Rochambeau, there's Lafayette, you name them, they were there. And they needed Andrew, because Washington was leading what was called the Grand Reconnaissance. The French had linked up with him, and he had a French army at his back. So now he was looking for some way he could bash his way onto Manhattan Island and work his way down and storm New York City and recapture it. So with Andrew's help, they spent the whole day going up and down the Harlem River and the Long Island Sound, looking for some way that Washington could get his army onto Manhattan in one piece and discombobulate the British. And unfortunately, they just couldn't find a clear pathway to victory. So they went back to Fordham. They dropped Andrew off at the farmstead. Whereupon Andrew was facing a very angry father. Now, as much as Andrew was a patriot, his father was a dyed-in-the-wool loyalist. And he was so mad at what Andrew did that day, he formally disowned Andrew from any inheritance. And this would cost Andrew later because the farm would be confiscated as a loyalist farm, but Andrew, having been disowned, had no legal claim to the property, so he just was left out in the cold altogether. He did eventually find another farm, and he made a great career raising varieties of fruit. It's a very interesting story behind this guy. But just imagine, you open the door one day and there's like this whole 20 officers looking at you and needing your help. And I can't go without giving a mention to Deborah Sampson, the woman soldier of the Revolution, who served most of her career as a soldier here in Westchester County. And in fact, she'd be wounded in a skirmish at Sleepy Hollow. Ooh, okay, you think she'd be discovered? Well, not quite. Well, she had a bullet wound in the leg, and she had a sword blow to the head. Well, she wanted to stay a soldier. So she concealed the leg wound as best she could, went to the field hospital. Said, "Doc, could you sew my head back together?" And he stitched up the wound. Whereupon then Deborah went out into the woods, took out her pocket knife, and dug the bullet out of her leg. No antiseptic, no anesthesia, nothing. I mean, people were tough in those days, and she was one very tough lady. And the amazing thing is she got away with it. She bandaged herself up. She didn't die of sepsis or anything. And though she would be discovered a little later on in the war. But she'd be honorably discharged, and there's a statue to her in her hometown of Massachusetts. So I might just mention a few. There were like dozens and dozens of clashes and skirmishes, and we'd be here all night just reciting the list. Well, one of the most important ones was the attack on the Ward House in Tuckahoe. And a shout out, there is a group of people, the Friends of the Stephen Ward House, who have just gotten funding from Westchester County and are trying to turn the still standing building into an historic site. We'll see how this turns out, but they're I know a lot of these people, so I can't praise them enough. But this was the result of a raid the Americans had launched on James Delancey down in Morrisania. Took some prisoners, they repossessed some of the cattle, made their way up the White Plains Road to the Stephen Ward House, where they figured, they'd sort things out, they'd give the militiamen their discharges, and nobody's going to follow us all the way up here. Well, they were wrong. The British did bird dog them all the way to the Stephen Ward House, and it was a very violent skirmish. Whereupon this monument over on the side is a monument to Captain Samuel Crawford, who was killed in the skirmish. And by the way, don't believe everything you see on a marker. I think I looked at this maybe 20 times and I never noticed. The date is wrong, November 18, 1777. It was actually March 16th, 1777 that the skirmish happened. But neither here nor there. But Samuel Crawford was a very prominent patriot, and you can't help but wonder if he had lived, would he have become one of the founders? We'll never know. Now, another notable incident was what's often called the Stockbridge Massacre. And this took place right in Van Cortlandt Park East, in the northeast corner of present-day Van Cortlandt Park, where a group of Stockbridge Native Americans were serving as scouts for Washington's army. Because they had all the woodcraft skills that were needed. Only they ran into an ambush. That was sponsored by John Graves Simcoe, Bannister Tarleton, and James Delancey, all-star cast. But they were trapped on three sides, and Chief Daniel Ninham and 17 of his men would die. And where they're buried, there's some controversy. They're somewhere I'd say within a half a mile of this monument, but exactly where nobody seems to know anymore. But if you're going up around Fishkill, on the road right between Beacon and Fishkill, there's this beautiful new monument, a larger-than-life monument depicting Chief Daniel Ninham. And it's worth pulling over and taking a look. Or if you're in the Bronx, we've got a much older monument there in Van Cortlandt Park, which is still honored to this day, every Memorial Day. Now, something like the Stockbridge Massacre, it kind of demanded payback. And the payback would be the Battle of Edgar's Lane that happened a month later. And this took place in, Hastings-on-Hudson, right about where Main Street joins Route 9. Route 9 at the time was the Albany Post Road. And this too is an ambush. It was organized by our friend Huck Odell, and one of the star players was Light Horse Harry Lee. And it was a very brief, very violent clash. In fact, one of the Hessians had his nose severed by a sword blow. It was pretty awful. But at least 23 were killed on the spot. And this too is commemorated by the Hastings Historical Society, sometimes biannually or maybe annually. I think there'll be one this year taking place. And one more notable instance stars a cousin of mine. So this is family history here. Young colonel by the name of Aaron Burr just passed his 23rd birthday. It was a young man's war. Even so, this is pretty good, 23 years old, near a full colonel. He was given command of the American lines, which at the moment, in the winter of 1779, were occupying that Tarrytown White Plains line. And he'd heard a lot of stories about all the depredations that James Delancey was carrying out up and down the Bronx River. Burr was kind of an action guy. He was like one of these, just do it people long before, the Nike came around. So they said, okay, we're going to do something. We're going to shut James Delancey down. So he was a very creative guy. He got some earthenware vessels. He filled them up with lamp oil. That was the best you could do for a Molotov cocktail in the 1770s. And he organized a hand-picked group of men, went galloping down the White Plains Road to Delancey's stronghold in West Farms, where Delancey had built a blockhouse that was commanding the southernmost bridge over the Bronx River. And it was the gateway to Morrisania and his loyalist enclave. And we don't know exactly what it looked like, but all these things were pretty much built to a pattern, so it probably resembled very closely this reproduction that's in Nova Scotia today. So it was the middle of the night, and remember this is February, not a good time to be out in the middle of the night. The garrison was all asleep, so they went up into it. They threw the lamp oil vessels in through the gun ports, followed it up with flaming torches, and the whole thing went up like a Ronson glider. Amazing thing is nobody got killed or even seriously injured. The garrison all tumbled out. Okay, you're our prisoners, and within 20 minutes, they're all galloping back up the White Plains Road. And just another notable raid, because this would result in another massacre. The Morrisania raid, January 1781. And for some reason, this qualified for a bicentennial commemorative postcard 50 years ago. But this was one of the most successful attacks made against Delancey's enclave. It was led by Colonel William Hull and did a lot of damage down there, and they took prisoners, horses, cattle, made their way back up. And Delancey, they failed to capture James Delancey, but he was not very happy with what had happened. So this too demanded payback. This is really the characteristic of the war, is this back and forth, action, payback, payback, action, back and forth, without any real resolution. But a couple months later, Delancey would organize what would turn into the Pines Bridge Massacre. And this was on the north side of the Croton River, just about where Yorktown Heights is today. And he actually hit one of the most stellar units in the American Army, which was manning the lines back then, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was the first purposely designed integrated unit in the American Army. Most of the men were African American. There were some Europeans, and there was also a company or two of Narragansett Native Americans. And they were taken by surprise, and a number of them were killed very, very violently, including the unit's commander, Colonel Christopher Green. And if you go to Yorktown Heights today, downtown Yorktown Heights, there's another new monument. They're really doing great with monuments lately. It's just unveiled, I think it was 3 years ago. And this, I think, is a wonderfully inclusive monument to an incident of the Revolution. It depicts the men of the 1st Rhode Island. You've got the African-American guy with the signature mitre hat with a big, huge anchor on it. And he's got his musket out. And Colonel Green is there with his sword over on the right. And standing in the back is a Narragansett Indian. Classic Algonquin fighting stance, weapon in each hand, tomahawk in one, pistol in the other. And this sculpture was done with such attention to detail, you can confidently say this fellow's a Narragansett Indian because you could look down at his feet and he's wearing a distinctive style of moccasin that was only known to the Narragansetts. That's how deep they went into this. So if you get a chance to go up there, in fact, sometime probably in late May, they have a weekend event, the Rochambeau Days, in which a big, huge encampment, reenactment, and all kinds of activities. So it may be worth checking out. And the main action took place, this building is still standing, the Davenport House. But I have to point out it's very much a private residence. It's maybe marked on the map, but don't try to go in. But from time to time, the Yorktown Historical Society does organize guided tours of the house. And there's still traces of the violence in some of the beams and woodwork of the house there. And the fighting in Westchester would go on right up till really the very end of the war. We hear about Yorktown, October 1781. Oh, that was the end of the war. Well, not here it wasn't. It still was this back and forth strike and payback cycle. And another prominent Westchester scout, Brom Dykeman, but it really should be pronounced Dykeman. If you're wondering if there's any relationship to the Dykeman farmhouse in Upper Manhattan, about 200th Street and Broadway, yes, that was the family farm. They were driven out of it, and Brom volunteered as a Westchester scout. And he was personally tasked by George Washington with bringing in either killing or capturing James Delancey. And he would spend the whole war trying to kill or capture James Delancey. And his last attempt was in March 1782. Once again, he failed to capture Delancey, and as they were heading back north, the Loyalists followed them, and there was a skirmish in what today is downtown Mount Vernon, where this historical marker is placed. Well, that's enough bloodshed. Have a little bit of fun stuff now. Spies! There was an espionage war going on, along with everything else, up and down the Bronx River Valley and throughout Westchester. And this would leave its mark in American literature. Year 1818, that fellow on the left there, young James Cooper, came down from upstate, bought a farm in what today is a part of the Fenway Golf Club in Scarsdale. He settled down. He wanted to be like a gentleman farmer with a career in literature, and he wasn't being very successful, and he was casting around for something that Americans would relate to and buy his books. He was a friend of the fellow on the left, John Jay, who lived up in Katona. And, Jay would become the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a diplomat, had an amazing career, but in the 1770s, he was a spy master here in Westchester. And he ran agents up and down Westchester spying on the British. And he and Cooper were friends, and they'd meet of an evening, and Jay would tell stories of his exploits during the war, being very careful not to name names. He was a good spy master in that regard. But Cooper has taken all this and says, I got material for a book here, a novel. And the result was The Spy. It was arguably the first bestseller by an American-born author. And it's still in print today. It's still worth reading, by the way. I'd recommend it. Well, no sooner did The Spy come out, and everybody started wondering, who is it based on? You know, it must have been based on a real person. These descriptions of the action are so vivid. Well, a case like that, the first one into print gets the prize. So very quickly, a fellow by the name of Enoch Crosby found himself a ghostwriter and came out with Enoch Crosby, or The Spy Unmasked. Now, he's generally accepted to be the model for the main protagonist in The Spy, a fellow by the name of Harvey Birch. But there is still some doubt, some controversy about that, but I won't get into that. It just goes on forever. But that's a picture of Enoch Crosby. And he was for real, though. He really was a spy. He really did have a number of very daring exploits in and around Westchester. And he's mentioned on, I think, at least 3 historical markers throughout the county. This is one of the nicest ones, the one up in Carmel. And also his grave, is commemorated to this day. Every Memorial Day, the Daughters of the American Revolution have a commemorative service, and they decorate the tombstone. Now, on the right, I just cannot get a good picture of this monument. It's making me crazy, but this is the best I can do. If you go to the Scarsdale Public Library, just outside the main entrance, as you go towards the parking lot, it's a very unusual monument to a fictional character. It's a monument to the spy, and it depicts Harvey Birch with his peddler's pack, making his weary way around. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but there's like a spectral visage of George Washington looking over his shoulder. Like I said, it's a very, very rare thing, but it's worth pausing and taking a look at. Now, I won't try to recite all the spies that were active, because there were quite a few. But probably one of the most consequential spy missions in Westchester County, in fact, one of the most consequential of the war, was carried out by a woman. Now, women at certain, of course, physically vulnerable, don't want to be out, out in the field risking your life, but women did have a certain advantage as spies. Because with the gender divides of the day, it was generally assumed by just about all men, and probably most women too, that, military stuff, guns and drums and flags and cannons, that's all guy stuff, it's like History Channel material. And a woman would neither know nor care anything about this. So it's very easy to play dumb, oh, I'm just a poor little woman, and what do I know? I'm not spying. Well, Ann Bates, she was a loyalist refugee from Philadelphia, and she volunteered her services as a spy to go up when the Americans were camped above White Plains, infiltrate the American camp, and report back on what she saw. Now, she didn't do this in her ball gown, of course. She put on like old ragged clothes, let her hair get ratty, and she got together a peddler's pack, just like Harvey Birch. Stuff like, combs, buttons, needles, and thread, that kind of stuff the Army didn't provide to soldiers. So she had a good cover story. And even though she was a woman, and everybody assumed she wouldn't care about anything military, Anne was married to a man who was an armorer for the British Army. He was one of the guys who was tasked with keeping all the muskets in order and the cannons clean and everything in tip-top shipshape. So consequently, Anne knew her way around an army camp. She knew what flags stood for, she knew calibers of guns, she knew different kinds of tents, all this kind of stuff. So she'd show up at the camp, just this poor ragged peddler woman, passed herself as a war widow, name of Mrs. Barnes. And indeed, there are quite a few war widows trying to scrape by at this point in the war. So they let her in. So, she's just a poor woman, What harm could she possibly do? Well, a lot of harm, as it turned out. Because she's going around the camp, doling out combs and buttons and stuff, and she's got her eye out. She's, noting officers' tents. She's counting regimental flags. So there's artillery park. Oh, there's a 3-pounder, a couple of 12-pounders. Oh, and a howitzer, too. And she's storing all this in her head. And on 2 occasions, she was just, so innocently happened to wander into Washington's headquarters, which was then the Purdy House, which is standing to this day in White Plains, and scene of a lot of reenactment and commemorative events. And on one occasion, she would get a glimpse of George Washington himself, just peering around the corner, before she was hustled out of the building. Hey, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm just, oot. That's where, well, she made her way back to New York, and she downloaded all the stuff that was in her head, and she turned in a startlingly accurate report of the numbers and conditions of the American Army as they existed at this point in August 1778. And this was consequential 2 ways. She's reporting back to the British commander, General Henry Clinton, who had just dispatched 5,000 troops to Newport, Rhode Island. He knew an American attack was coming. He wanted to keep Newport, so he decided to send reinforcements, shore up the garrison. Of course, he was a guy who's great at dithering. He no sooner sent the reinforcements, started wondering, I don't know, I'm making New York weak. What if Washington comes down to me like a ton of bricks and I lose New York, and maybe I should bring him back, I don't know. Well, Ann's report made it clear to him that Washington was in no shape to storm Manhattan Island. So he let the reinforcements go, and consequently the British held on to Newport, Rhode Island. And this would turn out to be consequential 200 years later, when the Purdy House was in danger of demolition, and a group of people, was then known as the White Plains Monument Association, wanted to preserve it. And there was some controversy about the Washington's headquarters thing. You had people up in the Miller House, just in North White Plains, North Castle, had been there for many, many years, and you might recall there was a sign on the parkway saying Washington's headquarters this way. And they would say, well, where are the real Washington's headquarters? I don't know about you guys, but there's no evidence Washington was ever in that house. Well, the Monument Committee dug up Ann's report, in which she specifically mentioned bowling her way into the headquarters and seeing George Washington. So, this was his headquarters in August of 1778. And that got the Purdy House preserved. And you can go and enjoy it today. It's the headquarters of what's now the White Plains Historical Society. And the spy war left its mark on the landscape in a number of ways. You had a number of reputed hanging trees that people point out. One of the most famous on the right there was on the road between Pelham Manor and Westchester Square. And it was said to be haunted by the ghost of a forlorn British lieutenant who was hanged there as a spy, or people going down the road to see this ghostly visage. Trees long gone, it came down in the 1930s. But there were others too. There was one near the Van Cortlandt House Manor in the Bronx, and or more famously at what today is the grounds of the Peekskill High School, which long ago was the Peekskill Military Academy. And it was attended by a young cadet by the name of L. Frank Baum, who literally followed a yellow brick road from the train station to get up there. I'm not making this up, and they're very proud of this up in Peekskill. But the tree was in the front yard, and who knows, what stories were spun about it. But it lasted until, I think, 2003 when it was hit by lightning. So there's no trace of it anymore. But still on the landscape, if you're ever up in Cortlandt Manor, you might come across Gallows Hill Road. And I took a picture of the street sign just to prove I'm not making this up. This really is on the map. And a great location for the Addams family, don't you think? But Gallows Hill Road leads uphill to what today is still known as Gallows Hill, with a body of water that is known as Spy Pond. And during the war, off and on, it was the center of an American encampment. And spies and deserters really were hanged there, including one very famous case where a British officer was taken as a spy in the camp, and he was court-martialed, sentenced to be hanged. The royal governor of New York sent a protest letter to the American commander. Saying, you can't hang this guy, he's a commissioned British officer. Like, dude, have some respect here. Well, he sent the letter to the wrong guy. The American commander was none other than Israel Putnam. Very famously plain-spoken, no-nonsense kind of guy. And his response to the royal governor became a classic. Sir, Nathan Palmer, a lieutenant in your service, was taken in my camp as a spy. He was tried as a spy. He was condemned as a spy. And you may rest assured, sir, he shall be hanged as a spy. P.S. Afternoon, he is hanged. Too bad for Lieutenant Palmer. And of course, the most famous spy mission of the war was the Arnold Andre affair, which came to grief right here in good old Westchester County beneath the tulip tree in Tarrytown. And I won't tell you the whole story because it's worth a weekend conference. And I've been to some of these conferences. There's a lot of detail to this tale, but suffice it to say, it's, Andre's last journey was through the neutral ground of Westchester County. And there's a monument in Tarrytown. It's right there on Broadway, right at the spot where Andre was captured. In fact, it's right on the border between Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. And if you happen to be going by that way, there's an interesting story behind the monument. I guess don't do this if you're driving, but if you're on foot, take a look at the base of that statue. Andre had been traveling under the guise of a merchant named John Anderson. And you look at the statue is the gift of John Anderson? What, Andre's donating his own monument or what? Fascinating story behind this. The real John Anderson was a very wealthy man in Tarrytown, and there's a long story of murder and madness and a link to Edgar Allan Poe. But I'll cover this later if you want to, but better keep moving on. And as the war went on, there was a lot of displaced persons who were literally burned or harried out of their homes. And a lot of people never made it back home. And one very famous refugee was Sarah Bishop. She'd been burned out of her home in Long Island and quite possibly assaulted by a British officer. We don't know for sure, but what is sure, she was permanently traumatized by the experience. She made her way across the Long Island Sound. Eventually she wound up in South Salem, where she spent the rest of her life as a hermit in what to this day is known as Sarah Bishop's Cave. Cave is still there. I've been to it. It's on private property now, but once in a blue moon, the local historical society will organize a tour to it. And it's not much of a cave. It's about 6 feet long by 4 feet wide. It's about enough room to lie down in, but she spent the last years of her life as a hermit living there, and she's still remembered to this day. And here I'm going out a little bit on thin ice, but it's too good a story not to include. Huldah of Bohemia, or AKA Huldah the Witch. If you go to the Old Dutch churchyard in where else, Sleepy Hollow, this name keeps coming up, doesn't it? There's this brand new tombstone, Huldah of Bohemia, herbalist, healer, patriot, felled by the British while protecting the militia and buried here in gratitude for her sacrifice. Now, a lot of historians have raised very serious doubts whether Huldah of Bohemia ever actually existed. The first documentation of the story dates to the 1890s, so take your pick. But the story is she was a hermit. She lived on what today is Rockefeller State Park, right by Spook Rock. There's a trail leading there, and it has its own stories, but I won't get into that either. And she was an herbalist, but a lot of people in Tarrytown and very standoffish about her. For one thing, she was from present-day Czechoslovakia, which is a very exotic origin, and 1770s Tarrytown. But when the British raided Tarrytown in March 1777, the militia gathered on a hill in present-day Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Holder, supposedly, this is the legend, showed up, got hold of a musket, and started picking off the British. Whereupon the British concentrated their fire on poor Huldah, and she went down in a hail of lead. Whereupon all the people in Tarrytown had been shunning her all these years. Oh, Huldah's not such a bad person after all. We ought to give her a decent Christian burial. It's the least we can do. But they gave her burial in an unmarked grave on the north side of the old Dutch church. North side, that's like the dark side, the shady side, the cold side, the semi-evil side of the church. And about 10 years ago, the Friends of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery got together, and they raised the money, and they got a very talented stone carver, a fellow by the name of Bob Carpenter, to create a tombstone in the correct late 1700s fashion of the area. And today it's probably the second most visited site in the cemetery, the Old Dutch churchyard, second only to the grave of Washington Irving himself. And people go there and they leave all kinds of like offerings of the tombstone. And I know this is going to sound crazy, but I've been there. There's things like coins, of course, they leave coins, but things like Mardi Gras beads, postage stamps, even a Tootsie Pop. I guess people just reach whatever's in their pocket to leave an offering. But a lot of coins, so if you need change for the bus, you know where to go. But if you're leaving coins there, please don't put them on top of the tombstone, because the copper in the coins leaches out, and that's why you've got these green streaks running down the tombstone. But the war eventually wound up as 1780 when the French arrived in the person of that splendid-looking fellow on the left, the Comte de Rochambeau, who eventually in 1781 marched in from Newport, Rhode Island, linked up with Washington's army, and together they carried out, the grand reconnaissance, which left Washington very depressed and frustrated. But it was quite a show. This is a painting of Washington and Rochambeau reviewing the French troops as they arrive. And you notice our friend, the Duc de Luzon, is over on the far right. So this guy always stands out in a crowd, with a costume like that. And if you're wondering why all these men are dressed like the Good Humor Man, that was actually the French field livery of the day. I don't know how you fight a war in a white uniform. And you don't have any Clorox or detergents. This hadn't been invented yet. But anyway, that was one of the best units in the French army, the Régiment de Soissonnais, or the Soissons Regiment. French did not send second-rate troops to our cause. But in a very humble farmhouse, where Rochambeau moved in to establish his headquarters, took place probably the most important council of the war. Washington's headquarters is just a piece down the road from what today is known as the Odell House, Rochambeau headquarters. Another shout out, there's another Friends of group, Rochambeau headquarters. Place is looking a lot better now. They're just on the brink of opening this as a restored museum historic site with a campus surrounding it depicting 18th century life. So keep an eye on them, probably sometime later this year, I'm told. But they came back, from the grand reconnaissance, Washington, I can't find any way onto Manhattan Island, I don't know what to do. Rochambeau sent word to him, George, come on over, I got a bit of news for you. Rochambeau had learned that the French fleet was coming north, not to New York City, but they're going to come as far as the Chesapeake Bay. So they got out their maps, and Rochambeau's arguing that, okay, if the French fleet makes its way to the Chesapeake Bay, if they can blockade the Chesapeake Bay, if they could fight off a British relief force, and if you and I, can fool the British into what we're doing and take our men on a 750 mad march in the middle of summer down to Yorktown, we could trap the army under George Cornwallis. And the rest is history. And its history is still commemorated this day. The Dobbs Ferry Historical Society has an annual event, the Road to Freedom. in which they set out from Gould Park there in Dobbs Ferry, and they replicate the first mile of the route to victory, to Yorktown, with flags, fife and drum and whole 9 yards. So anyway, so that kind of brings things to an end, but they had a saying in vaudeville, always send them out with a song. And after all this bloodshed and mayhem, I think I should let you all go on a lighter note. So think for a moment, what in our local culture is the most enduring legacy of the American Revolution in Westchester? And yes, the Headless Horseman. You see, he's for real. Look over there on the left. I mean, we saw him in Kingsland Point Park a couple of autumns ago. And where else? Sleepy Hollow. But if you don't believe all that, if you go to the old Dutch churchyard, there's a brand new historical marker telling you that the Headless Horseman tethers his horse there. So if you want to know some of the things that are going on this year, and there's going to be a lot of things going on this year, including right here at Phillips Manor Hall, log on to rw250.org. And if you like, you could sign up. There's a free newsletter, an electronic newsletter. Sign up for that. That will tell you everything that is going on in a particular month throughout Westchester, with directions, locations, everything you want to know. So you can really just spend the whole summer going from one reenactment to the other. So I recommend this very, very highly. And you'll probably see me wandering around at some of these events. Say hello if you like. So that about wraps it up. There's a nice book that's been written about it. I know the guy who wrote it. In fact, it's me. And Westchester and the American Revolution, Neutral Ground, with a cover depiction of John Andre being busted under the tulip tree. So I'll entertain any questions. It's just a little bit past 8. If we got a bit of time, I'll open the floor.
Thank you. Stephen Paul DeVillo, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So as Stephen said, if there are questions here in-house, we can certainly we can chat here. I just ask that you use the microphone so the folks that are watching at home can also listen to the question as well.
You're probably dying to know the John Anderson story and how Edgar Allan Poe gets into it. Okay, I'll tell you. The real John Anderson was a wealthy tobacco merchant from lower Manhattan, and he made scads of money with a number of innovations in the trade. One of the most important of which was having a very, very pretty young woman serve as a counter person in his shop. Now, this wasn't done in the 1840s. This was something new, and all these men in lower Manhattan, which business then was strictly 100% male, for lunch hour, they'd head over to John Anderson's, just look at the pretty lady. Her name was Mary Rogers. And they'd probably buy cigars they never smoked, just to, pay the rent, so to speak. So Mary Rogers became something of a local celebrity until she was found floating dead in the Hudson River off Weehawken. And the case has never been solved. Most of the speculation is that, not to mince words, but she died of an illicit abortion carried out in New Jersey. Well, this was a big mystery. A lot of people talked about it, and even Edgar Allan Poe heard about this all the way down in Philadelphia. And he was inspired to write his own solution of the case. This became The Mystery of Marie Roget, which didn't solve the case, but it's still worth reading anyway. Well, as to John Anderson, there was a lot of rumors and whispers going around that he was more involved in this case than he was letting on. That maybe he provided the money for the abortion, maybe he'd created the reason for the abortion in the first place. Just all smoke in the wind. There's no evidence, but this would dog Anderson for the rest of his life, to the point where he started losing his mind. And he bought a mansion in Tarrytown, settled down where he donated things like the John Paulding statue. But he started to believe that he was being haunted by the ghost of Mary Rogers, sometimes giving him business advice, sometimes threatening him. And by the end of his life, he was convinced that this vengeful ghost of Mary Rogers was literally haunting him, dogging his footsteps. By the time he died, he was living by himself. He was a widower, and he had barricaded himself in the Tarrytown mansion. He put steel shutters over all the doors and windows and was hunkered in there, in petrified fear of the ghost of Mary Rogers. And a curious fact that, I don't know if you've ever been to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, but he has a mausoleum in Greenwood Cemetery, big fancy mausoleum. It's done in the Greek Revival style. But unlike a typical Greek Revival mausoleum, this one has a portico front and back. It's very, very seldom done in this type of architecture. And every time I pass that mausoleum, I wonder, did John Anderson direct this so he'd have like a backdoor exit in case Mary Rogers followed him to Brooklyn? Who knows, but it's a tale of madness and murder and unsolved mystery, and Edgar Allan Poe gets into it. So that's something to think about when you're passing the monument. It's not just, you won't want to, who the heck is John Anderson? Well, now you know.
So I have some questions online. One person is asking if you could expand on it sounds like the name Cowboys. So it says the Cowboys, is it rustling cows to get money? Can you explain exactly what that means? Are they working cattle, stealing cattle? Where does that name come from?
No, it was stealing cattle. See, they needed some kind of a cash flow. They weren't being paid by the British Army establishment. So they needed some kind of money, like keep themselves, fed and clothed. So they made a habit of stealing cattle. Because now the British occupying New York City were a great market for cattle. All the beef they ate was stuff that was packed in Ireland into barrels and would have to undergo a 12-week voyage from Ireland to New York City. And by then, you crack open one of these barrels and it'd be like, putrid if any moisture got into it. So fresh beef, they're willing to pay and pay hard money for, gold and silver, not continental paper currency. So this was a very lucrative way of, keeping themselves maintained. And there was also a counterpoint over in Orange County, a fellow by the name of Claudius Smith, who copied this business model. And he would raid cattle throughout Orange. He became known as the Orange County Cowboy, or the Cowboy of the Ramapos. But the same thing, he would drive the cattle down to Paulus Hook, and British commissars would meet him, and with serious silver shillings to pay for the stuff.
All right, there we go. And so just speaking of the Headless Horseman, and knowing that the story deals with a haunting echo from the war, what were the residents of Tarrytown patriots or loyalists, and what was the atmosphere like? Were troops quartered there?
No, troops were not quartered there, but it was raided by the British on more than one occasion. The impression I have, and we don't have demographic statistics for any of this, but Tarrytown, I think, tended to be more patriot than loyalist. So that made them a very good target for a Hudson River raid from time to time. The Headless Horseman. Now, I have an appendix in the book in which I consider some of the possible origins of the Headless Horseman story, which some cases may trace as far back as Germany or Scotland or southern England. And there's also a number of rival Headless Horsemen, too, which notably, there's a Headless Horseman in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And if you go out to Basking Ridge and you ask anybody, they will insist our Headless Horseman was the real inspiration for Washington Irving. But the most common explanation, and this is for real, this is a true fact, at the closing action of the Battle of White Plains, 1st of November 1776, the day after Halloween, there was an abortive attack made on the American lines at Miller Hill. And it didn't get very far, but Americans opened up with a cannon, and a Hessian artilleryman on horseback had his head taken off by a cannonball, day after Halloween. And wouldn't you know, and nobody's ever picked up on this, the spot where this incident happened was just across the river from the original road to Tarrytown. It's on the map today as the old Tarrytown Road. So if you're wondering how he made his way to Sleepy Hollow without his head on, well, now you know. But I have another theory altogether, and I think Headless Horseman may have originated in Lower Manhattan in a ghoulish prank. Let me tell the story as I've given away too much. I want you to buy the book.
I was going to say, I'll just make a shameless plug here. If you'd like to discuss loyalists and patriots in Tarrytown or Sleepy Hollow, that was Philip's property back then, a part of the Manor of Phillipsburg. So
Yeah.
come to Phillips Manor Hall to learn all about it and discuss life in the neutral zone during the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But I think I'll throw it back to Michael. I think we're about to wrap things up here, unless anyone has any questions here.
We have a question here.
I'm intrigued by The Spy, and I'm wondering who the artist is.
I don't know. I dug this out of the copyright-free.
Okay, why I ask, it looks a lot like Howard Pyle's work.
Or I was thinking N.C. Wyeth. It might be
And
N.C.
NCY,
Wyeth.
okay, but they're related.
I'd like to research this, but I just haven't had the time to run
Right.
this down.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's a nice illustration, and it resembles somebody I know, but I won't get into that story.
Oh, David?
And speaking of The Spy, is it your feeling that Mary Phillips is the lady in the novel? Based on, I mean.
My gut feeling is no, but again, we don't know for sure. There was a lot of controversy about who was the origins for various characters. And for the record, both Cooper and Jay would vehemently deny that these were based on any real persons. And I think Jay at least was sincere. I think he was very careful not to name names of anybody. But that doesn't stop the speculation at all.
Well, thank you. Thank you,
Well,
Stephen.
thank you. I really appreciate you all coming out here.
My pleasure. For those of you who are not familiar, phillipsmanorhall.com is our events page, and you can find all sorts of different events. We're getting into the spring season. Things are going to be very event-driven. Our next lecture series is going to be coming up in May, and we'll have Daniel Holsabash, who's a legal constitutional historian at NYU School of Law. Professor Holsabash is going to present on how Phillips Hall lost its manor. Yes, Phillips Hall lost its manor. So revolutionary confiscation in New York is going to be the subject. And that will be Wednesday, May the 13th, 7 p.m., both live here at Phillips Manor Hall and also online for those of you who like to watch on your couch. Thank you all very much for coming by today. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.